which is one of the things that happens in cultures that survive, or at least as I look around, and I have a limited view, but is that you have one group of people that are charged with genetic propagation. They have children. And then there always seems to be a small group of people that are charged with mimetic propagation. This is how our culture works. And oftentimes those people are selected out and they are not supposed to be a part of the breeding pool. They aren't adding children. And this would be the example of, let's say, the Catholic Church, right? Who I've heard you say before, one of the Catholic social innovations was instead of just being focused on your kin, as in who you were related to, now you want to be focused on who is a brother in Christ. So now we're all working together and you've got a larger social system, but now you need some of the people to be who are the ones that are propagating, like how our rituals work, who gets married, how do different disputes get settled out, and then the ones that are having children. And I would say that it's not just the Catholics that didn't let their priests marry. This goes on in Norse cultures where they have seers. You have Buddhist cultures which have their own group of people that separate out, Chinese culture which has eunuchs. Is this a social technology that has been lost to time, that we run a very real risk that we may not be able to pass down our society, our civilizational knowledge, if we don't have this group of people that gave up the ability to propagate genetically and now are propagating memes?
Well, I think that there's a very real way in which the dispersal and the concentration of interests is one of the key variables that social technology shifts. And few are as fundamental as, say, giving up a certain companionship or giving up offspring, right? So celibacy, certainly, it's a very powerful social technology, and it's been used very productively. I will say, however, that in the modern context, right? In the modern context, I think that there is a lot of fertility depression of despair. Now, we have this thing called a demographic transition, where societies, once they become wealthy, tend to have fewer children. Usually what happens in all the societies that have become quite wealthy and industrialized so far, the result is sub-replacement fertility. The people in this society aren't dedicating themselves to mimetic transfer. I think they're just failing to propagate. So as long as we make a distinction of a dedication in an institutional context where you're basically, the church is your family or the monastery is your family, right? Like that type of dedication versus say, just an individualized sort of mild failure, right, to propagate. And the only reason why I'm pointing this nuance out is it's not to undercut your point at all, but just to remind people that we are in an era of, it's not yet visible, but I think we are in an era of global population decline, where fertility basically all over the world, except for Africa, is below replacement. Even places like India, you have entire provinces. It hasn't even gotten rich yet, but there are entire provinces with sub-replacement fertility. And India's vast country, 1.5 billion people, according to latest count. It's probably going to hit like a little below 2 billion, and it's never going to go above 2 billion. China is already in population decline as well. So, there's eras of demographic expansion and eras of demographic contraction. And there are eras of, range expansion and range contraction. So I think different social technologies thrive in different contexts. I think the priestly celibacy technology works exceptionally well in two environments. One is a highly urbanized environment where you need to take people out of social life to retain what truly matters. So that would be, say, the court, court eunuchs in China or whatever. Or, if you think about the hierarchy of the Catholic Church at the very center of various places in Europe. And the other context is a context of economic contraction, where what you're trying to do is dedicate your energies to the replacement of something. And I think that expresses itself less in an urban environment and more in a monastic environment. So if I were thinking of celibacy, I would be like, okay, it can be a tool in large hierarchical organizations that exist in a dense social context of many dynasties competing. How could you possibly be neutral if the papacy was just another dynasty, right? The papacy was powerful precisely because it wasn't just another dynasty. It wasn't just, a French king or an Anglican king or whatever. They would start eventually competing because it was not a dynasty in a context dominated by dynasties. That gave it a kind of neutrality and trustworthiness, though of course it still pursued its own interests, not just the will of God, however they interpreted it. Monasteries, though, I feel are things that are secluded from the world, where they construct alternate communities and they dedicate themselves to particular modes of life. And it's essentially the case that, instead of supporting their family, they support the monastery. And it's the monastery that then supports the continuation of the social technology. One way to think of a monastery is that, you talked about Dunbar's number earlier. How would you expand Dunbar's number in practice? Well, one way to do it is to make everyone kind of uniform and kind of predictable. What if we all rose at the same time and went to bed at the same time? What if we all ate our meals together that were cooked communally? What if we all wore the same clothes? What if we all had the same allowed list of possessions? Wait, that starts to sound like a monastery or a prison. The difference being a monastery is voluntary and a prison is not. So a super scaling of a household is the monastery. So in an era of economic contraction, technological simplification, like the early Dark Ages, the monastery, this super scaled household, can take onto itself, a lot of the functions that a functioning city would have, because it's vastly stronger. It's not a household of 10 people. It's a household of 100 people, of 200 people, right? And that's how I would break it up, right? It's sort of neutrality through celibacy, or investment in a super household that is then the super household is the one trying to maintain knowledge and so on. There's a third category, I guess, of the hermit, but I would say that the hermit, again, not having a family and going back to the village and doing whatever the hermit's preaching is, I think that's also read by people as a sign of neutrality. You're not just trying to install your kids above us, you're trying to be a prophet, basically.
The interesting thing about the Catholic Church, right? The monasteries, to your point, ended up being their own little enclaves where you now have a diversity of ideas, right? This is where the Jesuits came from. This is where different schools of thought pop up that are not necessarily against the papacy. They have to walk a line where they don't get just smashed out, but they're able to create some sort of diversity there. And then you have what in modern days is, the diocesan priests, which were, allowed to intermix in the society. The church became, as to your point, the family. And it's an interesting thing because the Catholics were able to keep a centralization of their resources in a way that the Protestants weren't once, in my reading of history, once the ministers were allowed to marry. Because now you create like a competition, right? The pastor isn't just the pastor of the church. He now has his own family, literal family, to look after and provide for and to give advantage to or whatever. But the Catholics didn't do that. And so they were able to integrate into society and continue the bureaucracy in a way that just didn't happen with people that were purporting to have, commune with God that didn't give something up. It almost feels like the Protestants tried to have that the person that was going to in between God without having the sacrifice that the celibacy of the Catholics had.
I mean, I think it's very obvious that the religious property was a notably larger component of Catholic society than Protestant society. You just look at, the cathedrals of Europe, right? Or you look at, land ownership, or you look at, again, any sort of measure. And part of the reason that the monastic, there is something of a very limited monastic tradition in Anglicanism that should be emphasized. So there do exist ways, even in Protestant societies, there are people who sometimes, give up family and so on for religious reasons. Though arguably, the Anglican Church, it's sort of interesting. It's like maybe the good way to describe it would be a Catholic church with Protestant characteristics. Like maybe that's what it was historically. Still, there's a big difference between the two. I think it results in some interesting distinctions. Like, I think that, say, the Catholics did a better job as societies of maintaining the humanities in particular, I think it's not an accident that so many people on the Supreme Court, even if they're Protestant, they're educated in what were Catholic founded schools, right? And Catholic founded, legal organizations. And, it's not just, a papist conspiracy to overthrow America as 19th century, commentators thought it was. I think it is a legitimate focus on a particular kind of institutional continuity in a thought. Even though the legal system itself is of course Protestant, it's common law.
Well, and you look at like the Jesuit Catholic university system, whether it's in the U.S. or abroad, one of the things that they did was allow philosophy in. And even when I was going to school in 2000, I remember my Protestant friends, the ones that were deeply Protestant, saying philosophy is Satan's whore, right? This is going to allow you to think about God in ways that you're not allowed to. But learning the basics of logic and philosophical thought allows you to apply it into things like jurisprudence in a way that if you've never been exposed to classical philosophical thought, you just don't have access to that way of thinking. Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.